Well, welcome to Unite, Unity Temple's weekly interspiritual service. I'm Reverend Nhien, and I'm just delighted to have you here today. Interspiritual, what that means for us is that while unity, here in Unity, we are both culturally and historically grounded in the teachings of Jesus, teachings such as grace, forgiveness, and love, rather than simply the teachings about Jesus, we also actively embrace practices and principles from the world's religious and spiritual traditions, understanding that all of these have something to teach us. And so as we gather together, we don't gather together necessarily to get everyone to believe the same thing, but we gather together in a spirit of love and unity, honoring this space of diversity among us. And we gather together ideally, again, not so much around a belief system, but around the practice of love, if you will, the practice of unity, and hopefully entering into an experience of love, unity, peace, and joy. So you are most welcome, whatever background you come from, whatever gender, whatever sexual orientation, religious affiliation, you are most welcome here into this space exactly as you are. And I want to make a side note too about that, because I've come into spiritual communities feeling sad and broken, and then wandered around only to have people have this sort of like, hi, this sort of level of joy in which, they would approach me. And if I'm in this place, even if people around me are joyful, I want to feel like it's okay to be where I am. And so I want to say that even though here, our focus today is on opening up to the possibility of the spirit of play, spontaneity, and joy, but we still hold the space that wherever you are in this moment of your life, that's okay, that is to be embraced here in this space, and that wherever you are, I personally invite you to make room for that. Because I deeply believe that true joy, true lightness comes only when we embrace the totality of who and where we are in this moment. And in that spirit, I'd like to introduce, for those of you who are new, the series that we're engaged in. We're in the 4th week of a 9-week series on wholeness and the Enneagram. And now, the Enneagram is this ancient tool of sacred psychology that helps us to map our own consciousness and how we relate to the world. In doing so, it helps us to understand that, depending on where we sit along that circle there on that right side, depending on where we sit, what our number is, hey, we might have a different orientation and different needs and a different spiritual path than the person sitting right next to us. And so we are journeying through the 9 points of the Enneagram, recognizing that depending on where you are, you're going to need a different nuanced path. And so here we focus on each of the points in order to help those who identify with a particular point, but also in order to support all of us in community in holding space for knowing that if someone else is that particular type, even if I'm not, I can make a little bit more space for the challenges faced by that particular type that I'm not facing. And I make this plea in particular today because today we happen to be focused on type number 1, which is my point on the Enneagram. So at first I was about to say, I'm so excited to be talking about point 1 today, but the truth of it is I am scared to death of this, because there's a part of me that's like, I'm going to stand up here and talk about what's hard or what's wrong about this particular type, which is my type, which are the challenges that I face in particular. And so even as today we hold the space for the possibility of expanding from wherever we are into a greater sense of joy in our lives. We honor, especially for those of us who are at point 1, that people of that point start with a lot of heaviness, with a lot of sense of burden and responsibility. Not that sense of spontaneity that we would have at that place that we call like an enlightened place. But the egoic structure of my particular type starts with, and I can even open right now with a brief story about how, one of my mentors in seminary watched one of my sermons, and I remember how dutifully I researched for this sermon, how much I prepared. And at the end, I felt like, it was depthful and all the stuff that I knew he would value. And he came up to me at the end. I said, what do you think? And his response was, authentic, depthful, profound. I was like, well, do you have any feedback for me? And his response was, no, but just that you enjoy it more, like that you enjoy doing it more. And that really made an impression on me, that how can we approach life in a way where, could it be for my joy? And so let's look at that here today. And so I'll let Maka, again, lead us into the spirit, wherever we each are, into maybe a broader experience of joy and lightness.
So to review a little bit, we have in the past 3 weeks addressed what's known as the inner triangle on the Enneagram. And this inner triangle is about the points 9, 6, and 3 on the Enneagram, but fundamentally, they're about each and every one of our journeys of having lost sight of the awareness of our oneness with all of life. And to trace that journey, we begin at point 9. And at point 9, there's this false belief that we have somehow managed to disconnect from oneness, from spirit, from that one source, if you will, right? And from that point, what happens is that each of us kind of falls into point 6, which is this deep existential fear, right? That like, oh crap, like having lost connection with oneness. Like a deep fear arises in each one of us. And then our Enneagram type flows from that. We go to point 3, which is the image type on the Enneagram, and we develop a personality or persona, and that's any one of the 9 numbers, on the map. So each of the types, in a way, each of our personas, each of our personalities and how we show up in the world is this false self that we construct in order to avoid the fear, the pain of our type, right? The 6-ishness, the fear of our type. So for the type 1, fundamentally what has happened is that the type 1 on the Enneagram has lost sight of its innate perfection. So imagine, that coming into the world, you actually lose sight of your basic goodness. And so the childhood message that is lost to the 1 is the message that you are good. So if we don't know that, and for some of us who have come from more traditional Christian backgrounds, we might have known that as young children, but then had our religion tell us otherwise. No, we are not actually born innately good, but rather we're born in original sin. And here in Unity, we actually teach a concept known as original blessing. And we fundamentally believe that each and every one of you, each and every person, is born with this fundamental wholeness and goodness. And that's why we have the spaciousness that we do around different spiritual beliefs. Because if I believe that about you, then I don't need you to believe the same thing that I believe for me to honor you as whole, as perfect, and as good. And so many of us, though, have the one-ish lesson early on somehow that, well, actually, I'm not approved of. I'm not comforted. I'm not taken care of unless I've done something to kind of prove my worthiness. And so the storyline of the type 1 is a kind of earned love, an earned sense of wholeness that then, over time, can deteriorate into a critical perfectionism that can stifle not only that personality type, but if anyone's been in relationship with a 1, the people around it, right? This idea that you start to become hypercritical of the world because rather than sensing into this truth of wholeness, goodness, and perfection, you start walking into a room and noticing exactly what's wrong in any situation. When I was practicing law in San Francisco about 12 years ago, I remember distinctly a moment before I had encountered the Enneagram where the reality of this sort of criticalness came to bear when here I was, like a baby attorney at the time in my second year of law school, and a partner at the law firm had given me one of his memos to edit. And I dutifully went about looking at this memo that he was going to be turning in to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and so I thought I was doing this great job by like examining it for everything that was wrong. So I give him the paper, and he comes back to me not long afterwards, and he looks at me and he says, "Nhien, you didn't edit my paper, you bled on it." I had put so many red correction marks on his document that he's basically like, "This is, you've bled on my paper." And it was in that moment, and sure, I realized that I was in a field, the law, where that precision around what is wrong with something was actually being supported on the outside, right? I mean, even though he kind of complained, he laughed and was like, "Oh, meaning you're good. You're good. You can correct even me." And so I saw in that this elevation of my personality type structure of like, the more I see that's wrong with things, the better I am. And that is the fallacy of the type 1. And what's wrong with doing that? I mean, there's nothing inherently wrong with being able to find things that need fixing or correcting, right? Because that's how we improve, our ability to sing. That's how we improve our writing. That's how we improve sort of our artwork, etc. So there's nothing actually innately wrong with being able to spot or identify what's faulty about something. Where it goes awry is where it causes suffering and where it becomes compulsive, right? Because each of us, just like every week we go over the types, each of us has a little bit of that type in us. Each of us has this skill. And it's valuable to be able to tap into any of these points of the Enneagram and to use this skill. When people identify as a particular type, what we're saying is that the type has become compulsive. You have forgotten your wholeness and identified with your persona or your personality. And in that, there is immense suffering because you know what? Then you're bleeding every day because that critical eye that looks back into yourself is then constantly tearing red all over. Yeah, it is painful, but you don't even realize it. If you're a type 1 or you're one with, that has a 1 wing, if you're a type 7 that goes to 1 under stress, if you've lived with a 1, you know the pain of living with this perfectionism, not as an occasional Let's skillfully apply this, right? But as a compulsive way of being in the world. One that at one point in my life, I mean, I've shared this story. I know you guys, the Halperins are here, and you have heard this, but I look back on the fact that I was probably 15 pounds lighter than I am now. And I would look in a mirror and literally have to go back to bed because I didn't like the way I looked, and I was nitpicking at my body, tearing red right into myself. And everything I did had that nature to it. But when you're like that from the start of your life practically, I'll tell you how far back it goes, the seriousness that comes with this sense of, oh no, the world's not perfect, and I'm not perfect, so I better be hyper vigilant. A fellow one tells me that at around the age of 3, her mom took her to an amusement park. And while she was there, she took her job so seriously that even though her little car was on the rail, so it can't go off, it can't go wrong, there she was as this little toddler, very seriously trying to stay right on track. And her mom tells the story about how diligently she worked to not make a mistake, and how seriously she took it. And talk about seriousness. Traditionally growing up, first 30 years of my life, had huge issues with the fact that I was critiqued as being fat when I was young, and just huge issues around it. But my mom tells a story of how, in my seriousness as a little girl, I wasn't like the kids that go jump around and play around. Oh, and by the way, 1's, when people are like, oh, the innocence of a child. And even when I read in the Bible, like, oh, enter the kingdom of God like a little child, and everyone's like, aw. And I'm thinking, oh my goodness, that's hard. Because if you look at a 1 as a little child, my mom would watch me go up to the refrigerator. And she's like, if I wanted food, I would just stare at it. Like, seriously, I just stand there, but not have any sort of playfulness and spontaneity. I mean, you think about that now. And the gap between that and like the person now who loves to go dancing. The person now who I have a sense of humor, like I crack jokes sometimes, but there was a huge gap of that. And so the invitation here is to look at the ways in which, not just the type 1's, but that there is a piece in each of us that takes life so seriously that there's a hyper focus on what is wrong and what needs to be corrected so that we can feel worthy or okay. The place in us, the place in society that says that to us, the place that says, hey, the advertisements that continually tell us where there's an ideal and we fall short, that reinforces this notion that wholeness is not innate to you. You're not just whole as you are. But if you buy this skin product, if you own this kind of home, and even in spiritual realms now, if you are this enlightened, and you read about the characteristics of enlightenment and you apply the same standards, I'm not okay until I'm that awake. It's like I'm not okay then when I'm not okay. And then we fail to give ourselves permission to be human in the process, because suddenly now the good and the whole and the holy all relate to a standard or ideal that is outside of ourselves. So even if we didn't have this propensity to make it a life path like I did, like a life path to be like that, there is a place, perhaps in each of us, that can feel into, wow, anytime there's some standard set outside myself to be a more compassionate or giving person, when I want something for myself, you know, or even, you know, the types here who are a little bit more serious, you know, the 5's and others like that, who are people who tell you to relax, and you're like, the idea that, oh, relaxed people are better people, and then you have this judgment of something that is like outside yourself, right? And so my hope is that today, as we feel into the space of the burden and the pain of the type 1, that we can feel into the ways in which we have integrated that in our own being. The gap between what is in you and what you think should be. Of course, the famous Brené Brown, who talks a ton about vulnerability, she has a book called The Gifts of Imperfection, and she tells us worthiness doesn't have a prerequisite, she says. And I want to share also wonderful saying she says about perfectionism and shame, because I want to invite you to feel into the ways in which, before I read that, I want to share. When I set it up earlier with the triad, having lost sight of your sense of wholeness, you fall into this sense of fear, and then you try to escape this existential angst by what? Creating an image, right? So the 1, rationally, irrationally, was like, oh, I have lost sight of my innate perfection and holiness. Oh my goodness. Like in that, there's this fear of not having my resources provided for by the world because I'm not lovable and I'm not worthy. So I'm going to run over here and create a personality that's going to strive to be worthy. I can become perfect enough if only I worked hard enough, etc. And so what happens, though, when I stop being willing to buy into that constant efforting and striving and battle to become something other than what I naturally am? What happens is I sink back into the very feelings that I was afraid to feel. And at that level, it's usually shame. Like there's a sense of, if you do not believe that you're whole and worthy, you're going to feel shame about it, right? Some of you might have heard the difference between guilt and shame. Guilt is that feeling based on something you've done, and shame is that feeling based on just who you are. And when this expert, Brené Brown, starts talking about it, she tells us that in the beginning, when I started talking about shame, everyone's like, I don't identify. You know, like of most of the population, even though she's famous now, and her TED Talk was like the most watched TED Talk ever, right? That tells you something about the role of shame in our society, right? The role of like, there's something wrong with just who I am. And so she says this about perfectionism. There's no quote up there for that. Perfectionism. Understanding the difference between healthy striving and perfectionism is critical to laying down the shield and picking up your life. Research shows that perfectionism hampers success. In fact, it's often the path to depression, anxiety, addiction, and life paralysis. And she also adds in her book, The Gifts of Imperfection, perfectionism is not the same thing as striving to be your best. Perfectionism is the belief that if we live perfect, look perfect, and act perfect, we can minimize or avoid the pain of blame, judgment, and shame. It's a shield. It's a 20-ton shield that we lug around thinking it will protect us, when in fact, it's the thing that's really preventing us from flight. So the willingness to let go of that shield, not only for ourselves, but on behalf of all others, to give ourselves a break and to understand the ways in which, if I right now have been feeling down or sad, angry, or frustrated, if that joy that Maka was singing about, that everyone's clapping about, I can't access, chances are I've taken myself too seriously. Chances are I've taken this structure, made this thing that I'm presenting to the world so all important, right? That I can't open up, like take down that shield and go into the crack of my own shame in order that I can open up to the light that is at the core of my being. But instead, what do most of us do in a habituated way? Oh, well, I mess up over here. I'm going to fix and fill in the cracks instead. I made a blunder. I'm going to make up for it and rally all of my social and other resources to kind of cover that up again and build that shield up again. And so in whatever way, maybe even just this week, you feel that you fell short of the mark of this idealized standard that maybe someone gave to you, a parent, or you took on mightily yourself. If you can consider that and the ways in which you hold yourself from joy and allow yourself the space of feeling into the vulnerability of the shame that is like beneath that, then maybe you might do what the one does as it moves toward integration. As the type 1 moves along the line towards integration, it moves to the type 7. I see a few 7s in here. The type 7 is known as the epicure. The type 7 is the type that is playful and spontaneous as a general matter, that seeks for fun, exploration, and adventure, that's willing to try things, even if it might make a mistake. The type 7, when we do our introductory Enneagram courses, a lot of the times we get this. We get this, oh, you're a 1, when they find out you're a 1. I get from the type 4s, oh, I'm a 4, and I must be the worst type. And then we get from the 7s, woohoo, like the sense of play, that like, I'm going to celebrate that this is my type. And so each of us can learn. The 7s have something else to learn, and we'll find out about that more next week. But the bulk of us can learn that, wow, there is perhaps, when they talk about enlightenment, they talk about the fact that when we become more enlightened, we enlighten up. We lighten up. But that's not a false lighting up of, let's just grin and look cheerful. Right? That's not a forced thing. Rather, it is an entering into the vulnerability that is the cover-up, right? All the stuff that we're not willing to kind of feel, that covers up the lightness that is beneath. So if we're willing to face the very thing that our striving for an ideal keeps us from feeling, and that's different for each of us, different for each type, whether it's pride or anger, whatever it is that's in us that we think, oh no, this is not okay. This does not fit my picture of who I'm supposed to be. Then something happens where we begin to take ourselves more lightly, where there's a lightness of being inside ourselves that spontaneously moves toward joy. And the type 1, in particular, can have a very difficult time with this. Because for the type 1 in particular, what happens is the 7 is what's known as the soul child for the 1. So what that means is early on, that piece in particular, play and spontaneity, are totally like repressed. What happens when something gets repressed in our psyche is that it never grows up. And so when a 1 first looks at this quality of spontaneity and joy and this possibility for play and permission, well, it's big in us. And we think, oh, if I let myself play, I'm never going back to work, you know? Like there's this, like, we're done here because all my life, right? And so there's a fear for each type that when you embrace your soul child, this is it. This is the end of the world. There's a reason why this was locked down and hidden, right? Because there's a belief that as soon as I let that go, irresponsibility. You know, if Atlas was charged with holding up the world, and I remember, this is a classic thing for many of us. We learn about Atlas, right? Holding the world on its shoulders. And then I read on like Korah once, well, who held up the world before Atlas? Or held up the cosmos? And I remember going, that's interesting. Now, who would hold up the world if I stopped? If I stopped trying to like be responsible and make everything better, who would hold up the world? And in that is the moment in which we fall back into, what do you actually believe? I'm a minister. Do I believe that God will hold up the world? Do I believe that there's a love that will hold up the world if I stop? Or do I believe I'm it, right? Can I play? Am I allowed to? I went to Ireland, and on a 10-day trip with Victor up there, who's sitting up there, and these people barely knew me, right? But at one point, one of the gals on the trip decides she's going to give me a little bell. She said, Nhien, I'd like you to ring this bell as a reminder to take recess. Can you even if I'm truly responsible for holding up the world, fixing and correcting everything that's wrong, what if I can take recess at least, right? And so that's a good reminder. I try to ring that at least once a day, to take recess, to be frivolous, to let yourself play as an act of faith that something else was holding up the world before Atlas had to. Maybe, right? And so the journey in each of us that takes that aspect of what we fear most if we stopped and let ourselves be frivolous. What if we stopped? And so the 1's unconscious childhood message is, it's not okay to make mistakes, right? If your lovability and your wholeness depends on this acquired perfection, how could it possibly be okay to make mistakes? How can it possibly be okay to be irresponsible? Well, you don't know that by thinking and wondering. You only know that by letting yourself free yourself to try, to do things and to fail, and to hold that space of love for yourself anyway. Because in a world that is not rigid, we all make mistakes. How we hold that space for ourselves teaches ourselves experientially, wow, you are good, you are whole, you are lovable, even if you haven't achieved that ideal yet over there, right? Maybe this is always the case, and the fear is, whoa, but now what am I going to do? If that's true, I won't strive anymore. That's the fear. But what if you tried it? What if you tried it? What if you took a recess every week what we do is we encourage everyone to say, for each of the types, let's go back a step. For the type 9, whose repressed child is the 3. So the 9 is the I'm not important, has this message that I'm not important. And the type 3 that it needs to move to is, I'm on stage now. I need to be seen. And so what happens is the 9 initially, because this was a repressed child, does what? Talks too much and too loudly in the beginning, right? Because they're trying to figure this out. So the 9 does that, and we in community get to hold space for that. Then we go to the 3. And the 3 is this achiever, this performer. But the 3 has dishonored in itself this deep fear and vulnerability. Because behind the mask of, I'm so great, I'm out here, look at me, is the scared little child at point 6. That fears the entire world, that just wants to huddle in a corner. And so the 3, in facing that fear, is going to be more timid and vulnerable. And so we give space for that. And then last week, we went over type 6. What happens? The type 6, which is the fear base, that is like chronically worried for all of their loved ones. It's like, well, if I don't, no one will, and then no one will be protected. And so the 6 learns to rest at the peaceful point 9, right? But the fear, of course, is when it moves there in the beginning, if I rest, I will never get back up. I just want to be lazy forever because my mind has been going for all of my life, right? And so we give permission in sacred community to support one another in saying, for you to find your truth and your wholeness, you gotta go too much one way. And finally, we come to the 1. And so the 1, again, has to find its way. And I know personally, it's a horrible experience. It's painful because you go and you're like, first of all, the 1 only lets itself play because, spiritually, I know I should now, and so you've decided it's okay to play. But then you play and then you mess up on something, and then your sermon's destroyed. You're, the horrors of that. But the healing doesn't come from the outer work that we do in the world. The healing comes from, wow, you know what? You just said something stupid to that person. You know what? That class you taught could have been a little better. But you know what? You're okay. And you love yourself anyway. And you begin to heal something. And since we believe that consciousness is linked, as we begin to heal that in each of us, that one-ishness in each of us, I believe we begin to heal it for the world. We let the world off the hook. And maybe the world does then become just a little bit more enlightened up because we gave it a break. Recess. Thank you, each one of you, for being here today. I do really hope that this week you take time from either the inner mental motions or the outer motions that would seek to fulfill your personality's notion of what's going to make you worthy. And then take a break from that and rest in stillness and let something within you teach you instead that profound inner truth of your innate goodness, your wholeness, and your lovability. So thank you for joining us today.